There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, their edges softened by routine, their weight hidden by familiarity. They come dressed as a Tuesday night, or a shared pizza, or the low hum of a movie you're not really watching. You don't recognize them as fault lines until long after the ground has shifted beneath you, until you look back and realize that everything you knew before that quiet, unassuming moment was part of a different landscape entirely, a country to which you can never return. For me, that moment was the precise and immeasurable pressure of William's head resting in my lap, his breathing evening out into the slow, deep rhythm of sleep, and the unspoken agreement that we would not, under any circumstances, acknowledge what was happening. We would let the silence hold it, a fragile vessel containing something far too precious and far too terrifying to name. He was a tempest contained in human form, a creature of kinetic energy and boundless, sun-drenched confidence. I had watched him for years, first from a distance, and then from the quiet orbit of our unlikely friendship. I saw him move through the world like he was parting water, his laughter a bright, percussive sound that drew people in, his smile a casual promise of warmth. He was a swimmer, and it was the perfect metaphor for his existence. He was always in motion, slicing through the dense medium of life with powerful, practiced strokes, leaving a wake of ripples that touched everyone around him. And I was a photographer. My entire life was built around stillness, around waiting for the precise fraction of a second when the world revealed a hidden truth. I lived in the spaces between actions, in the quiet inhale before a word, in the subtle shift of light across a face. We were, by every definition, opposites, and perhaps that was the foundation of our bond. He was the current, and I was the shore, the fixed point he always returned to. That night, like so many nights before it had begun to be, the current had stilled. The movie played on, casting flickering blue and orange light across the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, forgotten constellations. His hair, still faintly damp from a shower, was a dark spill of silk against the worn denim of my jeans. I could smell the clean, sharp scent of his shampoo, a scent that was becoming as familiar to me as the chemical tang of developer in my darkroom. My hand lay on the couch beside his head, a breath away from touching him, and the space between my fingertips and his hair felt charged with a voltage that made the fine hairs on my arms stand on end. Every instinct I had, every screaming nerve, urged me to close that gap, to thread my fingers into the soft strands, to feel the warmth of his scalp. But I didn't. I kept my hand perfectly still, a statue in a museum of my own agonizing restraint. This was the rule of our new, unspoken ritual. He could initiate the proximity, but I could not escalate it. He could build the bridge, but I was forbidden from being the first to cross. It was a form of exquisite torture, this nearness. For years, my feelings for him had been a quiet, subterranean river running beneath the placid surface of our friendship. I had contained them, managed them, diverted them into the art I made. I had hundreds of photographs of him, most of which he'd never seen. Pictures of him laughing with our teammates after a grueling practice, the exhaustion and euphoria warring in his eyes. Pictures of him staring out a window on a rainy afternoon, a rare moment of introspection settling on his features like a fine layer of dust, revealing a melancholy he never showed to anyone else. I had learned the topography of his face through a lens, memorizing the way a muscle in his jaw would tick when he was stressed, the tiny scar that bisected his left eyebrow, the exact shade of blue-green in his eyes when the light hit them just right. I loved him from a safe distance, a distance that protected the most important thing in my life, his friendship. I had convinced myself that this was enough, that this quiet, one-sided adoration was a sustainable form of existence. But this was different. This wasn't looking through a lens. This wasn't capturing a fleeting moment to be analyzed later in the solitary peace of my darkroom. This was tangible. This was the solid, living weight of him, the sound of his life force in the soft puff of his breath against my thigh. The boundary I had so carefully constructed, the clear line between friend and object of my impossible affection, had been eroded. He had walked right over it, fallen asleep on it, and in doing so, had left me stranded in a new and terrifying territory without a map. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the steady, sleeping rhythm of his breathing. I was hyper-aware of everything. The faint scent of his skin, the almost imperceptible rise and fall of his shoulders, the way one of his hands was curled into a loose fist on his own chest. It was too much information, a sensory overload that threatened to short-circuit my carefully managed composure. I was an observer by nature, but now I was part of the scene, and I had no idea what my role was supposed to be. I looked down at him, at the peaceful, unguarded expression on his face. In sleep, the restless energy that defined him was gone, replaced by a profound stillness. His brow was smooth, his mouth slightly parted. The lines of tension that so often bracketed his eyes had vanished. He looked younger, more vulnerable. He looked like the version of himself I had only ever glimpsed through my camera, the one I wasn't sure anyone else ever got to see. A wave of tenderness, so potent it almost made me gasp, washed over me. It was a dangerous feeling, far more dangerous than the quiet ache of longing I was used to. This was protective. This was fierce. This was the desperate urge to shield him from whatever storms had driven him to seek this strange, silent harbor with me. I wanted to keep him here, just like this, safe and sound and still. But I also knew, with a certainty that felt like a cold stone in my gut, that this couldn't last. This fragile bubble of quiet intimacy was destined to pop, and I was terrified of what would happen when it did. Would the sound of it deafen us? Would it blast us apart, back to our separate shores, with a chasm of awkwardness and regret between us? I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe and sync with him. In out. A slow, measured cadence. I tried to empty my mind, to just exist in the moment without analyzing it to death. But my mind was a traitor, a relentless engine of what-ifs. What did this mean? Did it mean anything at all? Was I just a convenient pillow, a warm body in a quiet room? Or was this his way of saying something he didn't have the words for? William was not a man of subtle emotional language. He was a creature of action and directness. If he was happy, he laughed. If he was angry, he slammed a door. If he was sad, he disappeared into the water, swimming lap after punishing lap until the feeling was beaten out of him. He didn't do ambiguity. And yet, here we were, living in the very heart of it. This entire ritual, this nightly pilgrimage to my couch, was a masterclass in unspoken, deniable intimacy. It was so unlike him that it felt like it had to be significant. But the hope that bloomed in my chest was a fragile, terrifying thing, and I did my best to crush it before it could take root. Hope was the enemy. Hope would make me careless. Hope would make me break the rules. And so I sat there, pinned beneath the weight of him, the weight of my own silence, and the even heavier weight of my hope. The movie ended, the credits rolled, and the screen went black, plunging the room into a deeper darkness, broken only by the faint orange glow of a street lamp outside my window. I didn't move. I just watched the sliver of light on the floor, listening to the two heartbeats in the room, one frantic and awake, the other slow and asleep, and I wondered how long we could pretend that they weren't beating for each other. I wondered how long I could survive in this beautiful, agonizing space between what was and what could be. Our story, like most, had a beginning rooted in the mundane chaos of college life. I met William during my sophomore year. He was already a legend on campus, the anchor of the university's championship swim team. He moved through the crowded student union like a minor deity, a coterie of friends and admirers always trailing in his wake. He was all bright teeth and easy laughter, the kind of person who seemed to have been born without an ounce of self-doubt. I, on the other hand, was most comfortable in the shadows, either tucked away in a corner of the library with a stack of art history books or lost in the red-lit solitude of the campus darkroom. My camera was a shield and a passport. It allowed me to observe the world without having to fully participate in it, to get close to people without the messy business of actual interaction. We were brought together by a mandatory general education class, a sprawling lecture on Renaissance art history held in an auditorium that smelled perpetually of stale coffee and damp wool. I sat in the back, as always, sketching details from the slides into my notebook. He sat in the front, as always, surrounded by other athletes who treated the 90-minute lecture as a designated nap time. I was aware of him in the way one is aware of the sun on a cloudy day, a persistent, distant brightness. I never imagined our paths would actually cross. The universe, however, had a penchant for irony. The final project required us to work in pairs, analyzing a piece of art at the university's small museum. When the professor called out the pairings, the sound of my name linked with his felt like a clerical error, a glitch in the matrix. He found me after class, clapping a hand on my shoulder that felt startlingly solid. "Leo, right?" he'd said, his voice even more resonant up close. "Guess we're partners," he grinned, and it was like someone had turned on a floodlight. I just nodded, my throat suddenly dry. I was intimidated, not by his campus celebrity, but by the sheer, unadulterated life force radiating from him. He was a supernova, and I was a speck of cosmic dust. "Look," he'd continued, running a hand through his perpetually damp, chlorine-scented hair. "I'll be honest with you. I don't know a Caravaggio from a car alarm. You're going to have to carry me on this one. But I'm a fast learner. Just tell me what to do." His directness was disarming. There was no pretense, no attempt to fake his way through it. It was the first time I saw the quality that would come to define him for me. A surprising, almost vulnerable honesty that lay just beneath the surface of his confident exterior. We spent the next few weeks meeting at the museum and the library. He was true to his word. He was a terrible art historian, but he was an incredibly dedicated student. I would talk about chiaroscuro and contrapposto, and he would listen with a focused intensity that I usually only saw in him right before a race. When he stood on the starting block, his body coiled and ready. He would ask questions, simple, direct questions that often cut through my academic jargon and forced me to explain things in a more human way. "So, the dark parts are dark to make the light parts look more important," he'd ask, squinting at a painting. And I'd find myself smiling. Basically, yes, he made me a better teacher, a clearer thinker. In return, I think I showed him a different kind of quiet, a different kind of focus. He'd watch me take notes or sketch, his usual restlessness subdued. Once, he said, "You're so calm. It's weird. Good weird, but weird." The day we finished our project, he invited me to watch one of his swim meets. I went, more out of a sense of reciprocal obligation than genuine interest. I found a seat high in the stands of the natatorium, the air thick with the smell of chlorine and the echoing shouts of the crowd. I had my camera with me, as always. And then I saw him. Stripped down to his briefs, standing on the block, he was transformed. The easygoing, slightly goofy guy from the library was gone. In his place was a creature of pure, focused power. Every muscle was delineated, his body a perfect machine built for one purpose. The starting pistol fired, and he sliced into the water with barely a splash. Watching him swim was like watching a force of nature. It wasn't just athleticism, it was artistry. The rhythmic pull of his arms, the powerful kick of his legs, the seamless way he turned at the wall, it was a dance of violent grace. And I started taking pictures. I forgot the crowd, the noise, the score. I just focused on him, on the arc of water spraying from his arm, the tension in his shoulders, the look of fierce, almost painful concentration on his face as he gasped for air. It was in that moment, looking through my viewfinder, that the quiet, subterranean river of my feelings began to form. I saw past the campus hero. I saw the dedication, the discipline, the lonely pursuit of perfection. I saw a vulnerability in his strength, a solitude in his public performance. He was beautiful, yes, in the most obvious, physical way. But what truly captured me, what planted the seed of this impossible affection, was the glimpse of the man behind the myth, the quiet engine driving the powerful machine. Our friendship solidified after that. The project was over, but we kept finding reasons to see each other. He dragged me out of the darkroom, complaining that I was going to turn into a mole. I'd make him sit still for more than 5 minutes, forcing him to watch a classic film he'd pretend to hate, but would secretly get invested in. We were an oddity, a source of mild confusion for our respective circles of friends. His teammates would clap me on the back and call me the professor. My art school friends would raise their eyebrows when the golden boy of the athletic department showed up at one of our gallery shows, looking endearingly out of place. We were from different worlds, but we had built a small, sovereign nation of two on the borderlands between them. For him, I think I was a refuge from the pressures of his world. I didn't care about his race times or his records. I didn't want anything from him. With me, he could just be William, a guy who got stressed about exams and sometimes felt cripplingly lonely in a room full of people. For me, He was a window to a world of light and air and easy physicality that I had always observed from a distance. He taught me how to throw a frisbee properly, how to not be terrified of social gatherings. He pulled me out of my shell, not by force, but by simply making the world outside seem less intimidating. And all the while, the river of my feelings for him grew deeper and wider, a secret I guarded with the same fierce protectiveness I now felt watching him sleep on my couch. I knew he was straight. He dated a succession of bright, pretty girls, most notably Sarah, a volleyball player he was with for the better part of 2 years. I was his friend, his confidant. I listened to him talk about them, offered advice, and felt a piece of my own heart chip away with every word. It was a pain I accepted as the price of admission. To have him in my life, even as just a friend, was worth the quiet agony of wanting more. I built my fortress of platonic affection brick by painful brick, and I learned to live inside it. The shift began subtly, not with a bang, but with a slow, almost imperceptible change in atmospheric pressure. It started the autumn after we graduated. We had both stayed in the city, him taking a demanding job as a software consultant that had him traveling constantly, me scraping by as a freelance photographer, shooting weddings and corporate events to fund my personal projects. We'd settled into a comfortable post-college rhythm, seeing each other once or twice a week, a stable fixture in the shifting landscape of our new adult lives. And then came his breakup with Sarah. It wasn't a dramatic, explosive end. It was a slow fade, a mutual recognition that their paths were diverging. There were no tears, no shouting matches, just a quiet, sad conversation that left William feeling hollowed out, unmoored from the future he had casually assumed was his. He showed up at my apartment the night it became official. He didn't call first. He just appeared at my door, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, his usual energy dimmed to a low flicker. He was holding a six-pack of beer, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Hey," he said, his voice flat. "Is it okay if I hang out for a bit? Just don't want to be alone." I stepped aside without a word, and he walked past me into the living room, sinking onto my worn-out sofa as if his bones were suddenly made of lead. He didn't talk about Sarah, not really. He just talked about nothing. The weather, a stupid project at work, a movie he'd half-watched on a plane. It was a verbal smokescreen, a desperate attempt to fill the silence that I could feel was screaming inside his head. I let him. I sat with him, listening, nodding, offering him the silent support that had become my primary role in his life. That was the first night he fell asleep on my couch. We had put on a movie, an old black and white noir I loved. Halfway through, his rambling monologue trailed off. I glanced over and saw his head had tipped back against the cushions, his mouth slightly open, a soft snore escaping his lips. He was utterly spent, emotionally and physically. A part of me, the part that had been in love with him for years, felt a painful lurch in my chest. But the larger part, the friend, just felt a profound wave of sympathy. I quietly got up, retrieved a blanket from my closet, and draped it over him. I turned off the television, leaving only a small lamp on, and went to my own bed, the sound of his soft snores a strange, comforting presence in my small apartment. It felt innocent. It felt like what any good friend would do for someone who was hurting. But then it happened again a few nights later, and again the following week. My apartment became his default destination after a long day, his sanctuary from the emptiness of his own place, which he'd once shared with Sarah. He never said as much. He'd always arrive with a pretext, a pizza, a question about his laptop, a desire to watch a game. But we both knew the real reason he was there. He was lonely, and my quiet, unassuming presence was a balm. The sleeping started to feel less like an accident and more like a destination. He'd arrive, we'd talk, we'd eat, we'd put on a movie, and at some point, his energy would just dissipate. He'd drift off, succumbing to a bone-deep weariness that seemed to have taken up permanent residence in him. I never said a word. I would just let him sleep, covering him with the blanket that now lived permanently on the back of the sofa, and retreat to my room, my heart a tangled mess of sympathy and selfish, hopeful longing. The real change, the one that began to erode the foundations of our platonic fortress, happened about a month into this new routine. He was on the couch. I was in the armchair opposite him, reading. The only light was my reading lamp, which cast a warm, isolated pool of gold in the otherwise dark room. He wasn't asleep yet, But he was close, his eyes closed, his body relaxed. He shifted, a restless movement, and then he spoke, his voice thick with impending sleep. "My neck is killing me." It was a simple complaint, nothing more. But I, ever the caretaker, replied without thinking. "You should use a pillow." He mumbled something unintelligible. Then, after a moment of silence, he said, "Your leg looks more comfortable." My heart stopped. I froze, the book heavy in my hands. The air thickened, suddenly charged with a new and dangerous possibility. This was a line. A clear, deliberate line being drawn in the sand. I didn't know what to say. My silence stretched, and I could feel him waiting in it. Then he moved. Slowly, almost tentatively, he slid down the couch and rested his head not on my leg, but on the cushion next to my thigh. It was a compromise, a test. A way to cross the line while leaving room for plausible deniability. He could pretend he was just aiming for the cushion, but we both knew. We both knew what that small movement signified. I remained perfectly still, my entire body rigid. I could feel the warmth radiating from his head, even through the cushion. He sighed, a soft, contented sound, and within minutes, his breathing deepened into the familiar rhythm of sleep. I sat there for hours, long after I'd stopped being able to read the words on the page, my mind racing. He had initiated. He had blurred the boundary. He had taken a step into that ambiguous territory, and he had done it under the cover of sleepiness, giving us both an out. It was brilliant, and it was terrifying, because I knew, with a sinking feeling of inevitability, that this was only the beginning. The ground was shifting, and I was losing my footing. The ritual began in earnest after that night. The pretense of the cushion was quickly abandoned. It became the new normal for him to end his evenings with his head in my lap. The transition was so seamless, so unspoken, that I could almost convince myself I'd imagined the initial hesitation. One night, he just did it, shifting from a seated position to lying down and resting his head on my thighs, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And I, caught in the tractor beam of my own yearning and my desperate fear of frightening him away, allowed it. I became a fixture, a piece of furniture with a heartbeat. My living room transformed into a liminal space, a zone governed by a new set of physical laws where the normal rules of platonic friendship were suspended from the moment he walked through the door until the moment he left in the morning. Each night was a detailed study in sensory torture. I became a connoisseur of the subtle variations. Some nights, he would be restless, his head shifting, his legs twitching, as if his dreams were filled with the anxieties of his waking hours. On those nights, my entire body would be tense, a silent co-participant in his turmoil. I would have to fight the overwhelming urge to soothe him, to place a hand on his shoulder or stroke his hair. The effort of that restraint left me feeling drained, as if I had run a marathon without moving a muscle. Other nights, he would fall into a deep, profound sleep almost instantly, his body heavy and completely still against me. Those were the nights that were somehow both the sweetest and the most painful. The sheer trust he was placing in me was a gift, a heavy, precious thing that I held with trembling hands. To be his safe harbor, the one place he could let his guard down so completely, was an honor that felt almost holy. But it was also a stark reminder of the chasm between the role I was playing and the role I wanted. I was his sanctuary, but I wanted to be his home. My life began to revolve around this ritual. I would find myself rushing home from a shoot, anxious to make sure the apartment was quiet and calm, ready for his arrival. I started buying the brand of coffee he liked, stocking the fridge with the sparkling water he drank. My space, which had always been so exclusively mine, began to reshape itself around him, making room for him in small, incremental ways. The physical space was a metaphor for my emotional landscape. He was taking up more and more room, colonizing my thoughts, my evenings, my very sense of self. I was losing the boundaries I had worked so hard to maintain, and the loss was both terrifying and exhilarating. I felt like I was living inside a photograph I was simultaneously taking, both the observer and the subject, watching this strange and beautiful intimacy unfold frame by painful frame. The progression was a slow, creeping tide. After a few weeks of him sleeping in my lap, another layer was added. We were watching a movie, and he was already in his usual position, his breathing slow and even. A particularly tense scene was playing, and my own hand, which was resting on the couch, had curled into a fist, my knuckles white. He stirred in his sleep, and his hand, which had been on his chest, flopped down, landing directly on top of mine. It wasn't a grab or a hold. It was just a soft, limp weight. My first instinct was to pull away, to retreat to the safety of not touching. But I was paralyzed. His skin was warm, his fingers slack. I could feel the faint, steady pulse in his wrist against the back of my hand. It was a connection, a circuit being completed. And so I stayed, my fist trapped beneath his open palm, my heart hammering a frantic, silent rhythm against my ribs. He didn't move his hand for the rest of the night. It stayed there, a warm, living paperweight, pinning me to the moment. My own hand began to ache from being held in such a tense position, but I didn't dare move, didn't dare unclench my fingers for fear of breaking the spell. This was a new level of ambiguity. A head in the lap could be explained away by comfort, by a lack of pillows. But this felt different. This felt like a subconscious reaching, a physical manifestation of a deeper need. Or was I just projecting? Was I constructing a whole narrative out of a random, sleepy movement? The internal debate raged, a silent courtroom drama playing out in my head while my body remained a statue of feigned nonchalance. I was the prosecutor, the defense attorney, and the terrified defendant all at once. This became the new addition to the ritual. Some nights his hand would find mine, other nights it wouldn't. I started to read his moods by it. If he was particularly stressed or withdrawn, his hand would seek mine out almost immediately, a small, unconscious plea for an anchor in the storm of his own mind. On nights when he seemed lighter, more himself, our hands would remain separate. I became a scholar of his unspoken language, an expert in the grammar of his gestures. I learned to distinguish between a touch born of exhaustion and a touch born of a deeper, more confusing need. The intimacy was building, layer by painstaking layer, like a photograph developing in a chemical bath, the image slowly emerging from the ether, still faint, still uncertain, but undeniably there. I thought I could live in that space forever. I thought I could survive on these scraps of deniable affection. The nightly ritual was a delicate ecosystem I was terrified to disturb. My fear of asking for more, of demanding clarity, was far greater than the quiet pain of wanting it. To ask the question, "What are we doing?" would be to force him to see what he was doing, and I was convinced that the moment he truly saw it, he would be horrified. He would retreat, and the fragile world we had built in the dim light of my living room would shatter. And so I said nothing. I guarded the silence. I became the keeper of our shared secret, even though I was the only one who consciously knew what the secret was. I lived for the evenings, for the weight of him, for the quiet hum of his presence. The rest of my day was just a waiting period, a long, empty hallway leading back to the one room where I felt both more alive and more terrified than I had ever been. I was a man holding a lit match, mesmerized by the flame, knowing that at any moment it could reach my fingers and burn me, but unable, unwilling, to let it go. The crossing happened on a Thursday. It was late November, and a cold, persistent rain had been falling all day, slicking the city streets with a dark gloss and rattling against my window panes. The sound created a sense of isolation, as if my small apartment were a ship adrift on a dark, churning sea. William had been quiet all evening. He'd arrived looking haggard, the collar of his coat damp, his face pale with exhaustion. He had just returned from a brutal 3-day business trip to Chicago, a whirlwind of meetings and forced smiles. He hadn't even offered a pretext for his visit tonight. He had just shown up, dropped his bag by the door, and collapsed onto the couch. We ate dinner in near silence, the only sounds the clinking of our forks and the drumming of the rain. Later, we settled into our usual positions. The television was on, but the volume was low, the flickering images just a backdrop to the heavy quiet in the room. His head was in my lap, and his eyes were closed, but I knew he wasn't asleep. His breathing was too shallow, too irregular. I could feel the tension in the set of his jaw, a subtle rigidity that wasn't there when he was truly at rest. His hand was not touching mine. It was resting on his stomach, his fingers drumming a restless, silent rhythm against his shirt. I continued to stare at the screen, pretending to be absorbed in the movie, but my every sense was attuned to him, to the tightly coiled energy radiating from his body. The air was thick with things unsaid, a palpable pressure building in the small space between us. Minutes stretched into an hour. The movie reached its climax, a flurry of action and dramatic music, but the tension in the room was of a different quality, quieter, deeper, and far more potent. I could feel his gaze on me, even with my own eyes fixed on the screen. It was a physical sensation, like the warmth of a sunbeam on my skin. Slowly, I lowered my eyes from the television and looked down at him. He was looking up at me, his eyes wide and startlingly clear in the dim light. The blue-green of his irises seemed to absorb the faint glow from the screen, and they were filled with an expression I had never seen before. It was a maelstrom of emotions, exhaustion, confusion, fear, and something else, something softer and more vulnerable that looked terrifyingly like a question. My breath caught in my throat. The entire world seemed to shrink, collapsing into the space between his eyes and mine. The sound of the rain, the movie, the city outside, it all faded away into a distant hum. There was only the weight of his head on my legs, the warmth of his body, and the unnerving intensity of his gaze. He didn't speak. He just kept looking at me, and in that look, I saw everything. I saw the loneliness that had driven him here night after night. I saw the confusion about why my presence was the only thing that seemed to quiet the noise in his head. I saw the fear of what that might mean. And beneath it all, I saw the hesitant, dawning realization of a feeling he couldn't yet name but could no longer deny. His eyes were saying everything his mouth couldn't. Slowly, deliberately, he sat up. The sudden loss of his weight was a shock, a cold emptiness spreading across my lap. He didn't move away. He just shifted, turning to face me fully, our knees almost touching. He was still looking at me with that same raw, unguarded expression. The silence was no longer heavy. It was fragile, a thin pane of glass that the slightest sound might shatter. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. This was it. The moment the ground gives way. The end of the ritual. The end of everything, or the beginning of it. He swallowed, the sound loud in the stillness. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he just lifted a hand, his movements slow, almost hesitant, as if he were moving through water. He didn't touch my face. He simply rested his palm against the side of my neck, his thumb brushing against my jawline. His skin was cool from the rain, but the point of contact sent a jolt of pure heat through my entire system. It was not a sleepy, accidental touch. It was deliberate. It was intentional. It was a question asked in the language he understood best, the language of touch. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just stared back at him, my own eyes burning with the years of unspoken feelings that were suddenly threatening to spill over. I let him see it. For the first time, I dropped the mask of the calm, platonic friend. I let him see the terror and the hope and the agonizing, desperate love I felt for him. I let my own gaze answer his question. He leaned in. It was the slowest, most tentative movement I had ever witnessed from him. It was a study in hesitation, a physical manifestation of his fear and his desire warring with each other. He was giving me every possible second to pull away, to stop him, to tell him this was a mistake. And I did nothing. I held my ground. I held his gaze. I chose to stay. When his lips finally met mine, it wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a whisper. It was a confession. It was the softest, most feather-light pressure, a moment of startling stillness. It was just the gentle press of his mouth against mine, and it felt like the world tilting on its axis. It was the breaking of a fever, the end of a long drought. In that single, breathtaking moment of contact, the years of quiet observation and silent yearning coalesced into a single point of stunning, terrifying clarity. He tasted faintly of coffee and rain, and the entire universe was contained in that taste. The kiss lasted only a few seconds, but it unspooled a lifetime of waiting. When he pulled back, his eyes were still wide, but the fear had been replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated wonder, as if he had just discovered a new color. The aftermath was not the gentle unfolding I had dreamed of, but a sudden, jarring recoil. The moment the kiss ended, the wonder in William's eyes was extinguished, snuffed out by a tidal wave of pure panic. He pulled back as if he'd touched a live wire, his hand dropping from my neck, his face paling. The connection between us snapped, and the air, which moments before had been thick with a fragile, beautiful energy, was suddenly filled with a cold, sharp dread. He stared at me, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his eyes wide with a horror that was directed as much at himself as it was at me. He looked like a man who had just woken up from a dream to find himself in a place he didn't recognize, with no idea how he had gotten there. He started, his voice a raw, broken whisper. He couldn't finish. He shook his head, a violent, jerky motion, as if trying to dislodge the memory of what had just happened. He scrambled to his feet, clumsy in his haste, nearly tripping over the coffee table. He wouldn't look at me. His gaze darted around the room, at the walls, the ceiling, the door, anywhere but at my face. The silence stretched, filled with the sound of his ragged breathing and the steady, indifferent drumming of the rain outside. I remained on the couch, frozen, the ghost of his lips still burning on mine. My heart, which had been soaring moments before, was now plummeting, a stone dropped into a deep, dark well. "Will," I said, my own voice barely audible. He flinched at the sound of his name. "I have to go," he said, his words clipped and strained. He grabbed his coat and his bag, his movements frantic, uncoordinated. He didn't even bother to put the coat on. He just clutched it to his chest like a shield. He fumbled with the doorknob, his back still to me. For a terrifying second, I thought he was going to leave without another word, disappearing into the night and taking our entire history with him. But he paused at the door, his hand on the knob, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the closed door. "Leo, I'm so sorry." And then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound unnaturally loud in the suddenly vast emptiness of the apartment. I was left alone in the flickering light of the television, the scent of rain and his panicked departure hanging in the air. The warmth where he had been sitting on the couch was already beginning to fade. I lifted my fingers to my lips, half expecting to find them bruised. They just felt cold. I had been so wrong. It wasn't the beginning of everything. It was the end. The beautiful, fragile thing we had been building had not just been shattered. It had been disavowed, apologized for, treated like a shameful mistake. The pain was a physical thing, a sharp, cold blade twisting in my gut. I had allowed myself to hope, and this was the price. The days that followed were a study in silence. A thick, suffocating blanket of it descended upon my life. I sent him a text the next day, a simple, "Are you okay?" It remained unread for hours, and then, finally, the 2 blue check marks appeared, followed by nothing. No reply, no explanation, just the digital confirmation that my message had been received and ignored. I tried calling him that evening, but it went straight to voicemail, his familiar, cheerful greeting a cruel mockery. He was avoiding me. He was erasing me. The ritual was broken, the sanctuary boarded up. My apartment, which had been a haven, now felt like a tomb, each piece of furniture a monument to a ghost. The couch was the worst. I couldn't even look at it without feeling a fresh wave of nausea. The indentation where he always sat seemed permanently etched into the cushions. My mind became a torture chamber of self-recrimination. I replayed the kiss, the moments leading up to it, our entire history, over and over again, searching for the point where I had gone wrong. Had I misinterpreted everything? Had I seen desire where there was only desperation and loneliness? Was the kiss not a confession from him, but a moment of weakness, a temporary insanity brought on by exhaustion and grief that he now deeply regretted? His apology echoed in my head. "I'm so sorry." He was sorry for kissing me, sorry for wanting me, even for a second. The shame I had seen in his eyes, I had mistaken it for wonder. The thought was unbearable. It invalidated not just the kiss, but every quiet moment, every shared silence, every touch that I had so carefully cataloged and cherished. It made me a fool, a man who had built a palace of meaning out of thin air. After 3 days of this agonizing silence, something inside me shifted. The pain was still there, a deep, resonant ache, but it was being slowly eclipsed by a rising tide of anger. Not a hot, explosive anger, but a cold, quiet fury. I was angry at him for his cowardice, for running away without a single word of explanation. I was angry at him for making me feel like our intimacy was something to be ashamed of. But most of all, I was angry at myself for allowing the silence, for being so passive, for always being the quiet observer who never demanded to be seen. I had spent years hiding my feelings to protect our friendship, and in the end, It was his inability to face his own that was destroying it anyway. I had nothing left to lose. The friendship, as I knew it, was already dead. That evening, I put on my jacket and walked to his apartment. It was a 20-minute walk, and the cold air felt good against my heated skin. I didn't know what I was going to say. I just knew that I could not let it end like this, with an apology whispered to a door and a ghost in my living room. I needed to look him in the eye. I needed to replace the deafening silence with something real, even if it was a painful truth. When I arrived at his building, I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, my resolve wavering. But then I thought of his face in that final moment. The panic and the shame and the cold anger returned, propelling me forward. I buzzed his apartment. For a long moment, there was no answer. I was about to turn away when the speaker crackled to life. "Who is it?" His voice was strained, wary. "It's me," I said, my own voice firmer than I expected. "Let me in, Will." The silence stretched again. I could picture him in his apartment, staring at the intercom, warring with himself. Finally, with a sigh of static, the lock buzzed. I pushed the door open and took the stairs to his fourth-floor walk-up, my heart pounding with a mixture of dread and determination. He was waiting at his open door, leaning against the frame. He looked terrible. He was wearing the same sweats he'd probably been in for days. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his hair was a mess. He looked like a man who had been wrestling with a demon and losing. "What are you doing here, Leo?" he asked, his voice low. He didn't meet my eyes. "You know why I'm here," I said, walking past him into the apartment. It was a mess. Takeout containers littered the coffee table. Clothes were strewn over a chair. It was the habitat of a man in hiding. I turned to face him as he slowly closed the door. "You can't just do that, Will. You can't kiss me like that and then vanish. You don't get to apologize and run away and leave me to figure out what the hell happened." He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a misery so profound it almost broke my anger. "I know," he said, his voice cracking. "I know. I'm a coward." "I don't care if you're a coward," I said, my voice rising slightly. "I care that you made me feel. You made what happened between us feel dirty. You apologized for it. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" Tears welled in his eyes, and he looked away, scrubbing a hand over his face. "It's not you, Leo. It was never about you. It's me. I'm so messed up." He paced the small living room, running his hands through his hair, the picture of caged restlessness. "I don't know what's happening. After Sarah, I was so lonely. And your place, being with you, it was the only time I felt quiet. The only time the noise stopped." He stopped pacing and looked at me, his expression one of desperate, pleading confusion. "And then it wasn't enough just to be there. I needed more. I needed to be closer. I didn't understand it. I just knew that I needed it. I needed you." He took a shaky breath, the confession tumbling out of him now. "That night, I wasn't just tired, Leo. I wanted to kiss you. I wanted it so badly I couldn't breathe. And when I did, for a second, it was the most right thing I have ever felt in my entire life." He choked on the words, a single tear tracing a path through the stubble on his cheek. And that terrified me. Because what does that mean? I've never felt that for a guy. I looked at what I had done, what I had felt, and I didn't recognize myself. I panicked. I thought I had ruined everything. I thought I had used your friendship, your kindness, to sort out my own messed up head, and that I had destroyed the best thing in my life in the process. I was sorry because I hurt you. I was sorry because I was a coward." He stood there in the middle of his messy apartment, completely undone, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. He had finally said it all, not to a door, but to my face. The anger in me dissolved, washed away by the raw, painful honesty of his words. He wasn't ashamed of me. He was terrified of himself. He hadn't been running from me. He had been running from a feeling he didn't know how to name, a part of himself he had just discovered and didn't know how to accept. The space between us was no longer filled with silence or anger, but with a fragile, aching vulnerability. It was my turn to cross a bridge. The silence that fell after his confession was different. It wasn't the suffocating, anxious silence of the past few days, nor was it the heavy, unspoken silence of our nightly rituals. This was a cleared space, a field after a storm, raw and exposed, but ready for new growth. He stood there, looking utterly wrecked, his entire being a question mark. He had laid his confusion and his fear at my feet, and he was waiting, terrified, for my judgment. The cold fury I had carried all the way to his door had completely evaporated, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it felt like my own emotion. I saw not the campus hero or the confident consultant, but a man completely adrift, his own internal compass spinning wildly, searching for a fixed point. I closed the distance between us, my own movements slow and deliberate. I stopped a few feet from him, giving him space, but making it clear I wasn't going to run. His eyes were still shining with unshed tears, his posture defensive, as if bracing for a blow. I took a deep breath, the air in his apartment stale with anxiety. "Will," I said, my voice quiet, stripped of all anger. "You think you just figured this out? You think this is new?" He looked at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. I offered him a small, sad smile. "I have been in love with you for 7 years." The words hung in the air between us. It was my own confession, my own truth laid bare. I watched as the meaning of it landed, as his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and then to a dawning, staggering comprehension. His eyes widened, and he scanned my face as if seeing it for the first time. I could see the gears turning in his head, the past few months, the past few years, being recontextualized in a stunning, brilliant flash. The couch, the quiet evenings, the way I looked at him, the thousands of small things he had probably never even registered. It all snapped into a new focus for him. "What?" he whispered, the word barely a puff of air. "The first time I saw you swim," I continued, the story pouring out of me now that the dam was broken. "At that meet in sophomore year. That's when it started. Everything since then, my friendship, my support, listening to you talk about Sarah, it was all real. But it was always layered. There was always this other thing underneath it, this thing I never, ever thought I'd get to say out loud." I took another step closer, my voice dropping even lower. "So when you tell me you felt like kissing me was the most right thing in your life, you need to understand that you weren't alone in that feeling. You weren't trespassing. You were just finally coming home." He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. The entire foundation of his panic, the idea that he had crossed a line, that he had introduced a foreign, unwelcome feeling into our dynamic, had just crumbled. He hadn't been the unknowing initiator of something strange and new. He had been the unknowing respondent to something that had been there all along. He sank onto the arm of his sofa as if his legs could no longer support him, his gaze distant, lost in the sudden, overwhelming landscape of our shared history, now fully revealed. "All this time," he murmured to himself. "All this time, you just waited." "I wasn't waiting," I corrected him gently. "I was living. I was your friend. That was enough. I never would have risked that. Ever. You were the one who risked it, Will. You were the brave one. You just didn't know it." He looked up at me then, and the storm in his eyes had finally passed. What was left was a profound, quiet clarity. And in that clarity, I saw a flicker of the same wonder I had seen in the moments after the kiss. But this time it wasn't followed by panic. It was followed by a slow, hesitant smile. "God," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "I'm an idiot." It wasn't an apology. It was a statement of fact, a realization, and it was the most hopeful sound I had ever heard. The dry irony, the self-deprecation, that was the William the first knew. He was finding his footing again, not on the old ground, but on this new, shared territory we had just uncovered. I closed the remaining space between us and sat on the coffee table in front of him, our knees touching, mirroring our positions from that fateful night. But this time there was no ambiguity, no fear. I reached out and took his hand. His fingers, which had been so tense, relaxed and curled around mine. It felt different from all the other times our hands had touched. This was not a subconscious reach for comfort. This was a choice. A conscious, deliberate connection. "You're not an idiot," I said softly. "You were just listening to a part of yourself you'd been taught to ignore. It just took you a while to understand the language." He squeezed my hand, his thumb stroking over my knuckles. "So what happens now?" he asked, his voice small, vulnerable. "Now," I said, meeting his gaze, my heart finally settling into a slow, steady rhythm. We learned the language together. There was no grand, cinematic moment of resolution. There was just a long, quiet conversation in a messy apartment, two hands clasped together, and the slow, steady dawn of a new reality. We talked for hours. He asked questions, tentative at first, then more confident. He wanted to know everything. to revisit memories with this new lens. I told him about the photographs, about the quiet ache of being his friend, about the terror and the joy of the nightly ritual. And he told me about the gnawing loneliness, the feeling of being disconnected even in a crowd, and how my quiet presence had felt like the only real thing in his life for months. We were not defining what we were. We were simply uncovering it, excavating a truth that had been buried under years of friendship and fear. When the sun began to rise, casting a pale, gray light into the room, we were both exhausted, but it was a good exhaustion, the clean fatigue that comes after a long and necessary journey. He looked at me, his eyes soft in the morning light. "Stay," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a plea and a promise. I did. We fell asleep in his bed, not out of pretext or exhaustion, but out of a simple, profound desire to be near each other. There was no anxiety, no analysis, just the quiet comfort of his arm around my waist and the steady rhythm of his breathing against my back. The new normal began not with a declaration, but with the quiet domesticity of making coffee the next morning. It was in the easy way he moved around me in the small kitchen, the way he passed me a mug without asking how I took it, because he already knew. It was in the way I watched him stretch, the morning light catching the familiar lines of his body, and felt not a painful yearning, but a quiet, steady sense of peace. This was real. This was ours. The couch in my apartment was no longer a stage for our nightly drama of ambiguity. It was just a couch. A few nights later, he was over, and we were watching a movie. He leaned against me, his head resting on my shoulder, his hand finding mine and lacing our fingers together. It was simple. It was easy. There was no underlying tension, no frantic internal monologue on my part. The weight of him was no longer a burden of unspoken things, but a comforting, solid presence. The observer in me had finally retired. I was no longer documenting the moment. I was simply living in it. We had spent so long communicating in the spaces between words, in the language of touch and silence, that when we finally learned to speak, we found we didn't need many words at all. Our home wasn't a place. It was this, the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create and finally to share. And in that quiet, we began to build our future, one shared morning, one easy touch, one peaceful night at a time.